From the way the two shows approached their source material, to the Dance of the Dragons being a background event in the A Song of Ice and Fire universe, here's the real reason House of the Dragon has destroyed Game of Thrones. One of the biggest problems going from Thrones to Dragon is the shrink in scope, and that difference can be seen in the opening credits. When it used to be Thrones O'Clock, the show would kick off with the iconic theme song, and you'd see all the important locations in the show. Not only was it cool, it helped keep track of where things were in relation to each other. Since the story was so huge, it was easy to get lost. As an added bonus, they wouldn't stick to a single pre-made opening either, adding and removing locations as their importance shifted. Meanwhile, House of the Dragon's opening credits are so uninspired, they didn't make a new theme for it. All you see in the opening is blood flowing in rivers, closing in on a pit of fire because fire and blood. Those bloodlines show us the family tree of House Targaryen, which reflects the show's narrow focus on them and those associated with them. The show takes place almost entirely in either King's Landing or Dragonstone. The former is where the king, a Targaryen, is supposed to live, while the latter is the Targaryens' home turf. If you're lucky, you might get to head to Driftmark. The only family besides the Targaryens that matters is the Velaryons. So why does that epicness matter? Because Game of Thrones found depth in the expanse. Before Daenerys showed up in Westeros with her dragons, travel and logistics were important parts of the Game of Thrones story. Looking back on the earlier seasons of the show, much was centered on the challenges of marching an army halfway across a continent, or attacking or defending cities and castles. I know that sounds boring, but many of the iconic scenes of the show came from those elements. For example, the Red Wedding, the most infamous scene that happened in HBO's flagship series. Why did it happen? Well, Robb betrayed the marriage pact he made with House Frey. Why did he make that pact? He needed to cross a bridge. This sort of thing would never happen on House of the Dragon, because the dragons are cheat codes for the story. If something happens in Dragonstone, the Targaryens in King's Landing can hop on their dragons and be there quickly. When the Dance of the Dragons kicks off, the Greens and the Blacks will need other houses to join them, but only so they can have bodies to throw at each other. At the end of the day, Westeros doesn't matter to the story of House of the Dragon. Nothing does, except Targaryen and Velaryon family politics. Let's talk about the politics of both shows, as they're quite different from each other. The plot of Thrones is about the War of the Five Kings, a battle for succession that pulls in Houses Lannister, Baratheon, and Stark, with House Greyjoy crashing the party uninvited. But neither of these houses can win the war on their own, since they don't have dragons to threaten the other houses to join them. They have to rely on historic ties and political intrigue. You can see that the northern houses see the Starks as their leaders. When Ned is killed and Robb strikes out for revenge, the North rallies behind him, except for the ones that have ambitions of their own. Meanwhile, the Lannisters are experts at slimy tactics, and so they negotiate and threaten their way into securing alliances. These dynamics make the world feel like a real place with a real history, and more than the White Walkers and dragons, it was the intrigue that drew audiences to Thrones. On House of the Dragon, you mostly see characters squabble against each other, which you could see in any fantasy series. When it's time for the Greens and the Blacks to go to war, the houses are obliged to pick sides based on their blood ties to either Rhaenyra or Aegon. It might sound like the Targaryens are bad, but Thrones actually had a pretty interesting Targaryen storyline. We learn about the Mad King Aerys, the last Targaryen ruler. He was so crazy that he ticked off both House Stark and Baratheon at the same time, and two houses were able to rally most of Westeros to overthrow him. Two of his kids managed to escape, with one crowned with molten gold. That left Daenerys, the one true Targaryen heir, whose goal is to build an army in Essos, sail it across the Narrow Sea, and get to some conquering. Though she has 3 dragons, that doesn't mean she can waltz in and take what she wants. Her adventures in Essos teach her important lessons about dealing with complex issues like the slave trade, while also shaping her moral compass. Daenerys was a great character, and a lot of people were rooting for her to take the Iron Throne. None of the Targaryens in Dragon are nearly as cool or interesting as her, so it's hard to get behind seeing any of them succeed. Whether you're a green supporter or a black supporter, you're just supporting different flavors of the same rotten apple. The chances of House of the Dragon succeeding were slim, if only because Game of Thrones was such a tough act to follow. People who watch the Lord of the Rings movies, when they came out, say that they knew history had been made. And that's exactly the sort of show Thrones was. Where Lord of the Rings had once given folks an expectation of how fantasy stories were supposed to look, Thrones stripped away some of the magic from Tolkien's classic. Not to mention all of the whimsy, replacing them with war stories and political intrigue that draw from the real world. As much as we enjoyed watching Frodo carry a ring to a volcano, it was just as exciting to see these realistic characters trying to climb the ladder of chaos. If you liked someone, you'd want nothing more than to see them succeed. And if you hated someone, you'd happily kill them yourself if you could. There's a reason why people used to gather in bars and pubs to watch the big episodes of the show like they were sports games, and the videos of people reacting to the Red Wedding or the death of the Viper just show the impact Thrones had. Can the franchise get that mojo back? Not if House of the Dragon is anything to go by. All things considered, Dragon isn't a terrible show, and I do have to admit that it's better than the final seasons of Game of Thrones. But HBO's considering a whole slate of Thrones spin-offs, and they're reaching into different parts of the history of the universe for material. If Dragon is as good as any of these spin-offs is going to get, that's a bad sign for the future of the franchise. At the peak of its potential, House of the Dragon could never have the impact that Game of Thrones had, and that's because this story just isn't as interesting. In fairness, it wasn't supposed to be, since the Dance of the Dragons was a background event in the A Song of Ice and Fire universe. George R.R. Martin spent more time developing the history of this universe than most writers would. But at the end of the day, he didn't invest as much into this story as he did in the main storyline. It's obvious that Martin, in writing the history of the Targaryen dynasty, wanted to come up with a dramatic story of how their empire fell apart. So we have The Dance, a story of terrible people doing terrible things to each other. The only thing it cost them was the entire kingdom, and possibly their own lives. It isn't that interesting, and it wasn't supposed to be. But it isn't all George's fault, because if he left any blanks in the story, this was a great opportunity for the writers of the show to fill them in. Unfortunately, their vision for how to develop the story falls a bit flat. Sure, they did a good job of humanizing some of the characters, and there are some interesting choices they've made that work better than what George came up with. But all things considered, they aren't up to the task of improving on George's work. So from this story being only a background event in the Game of Thrones universe, to the difference in the way the two shows approached their source material, that was the real reason House of the Dragon has destroyed Game of Thrones.